Right, good afternoon everyone. First Schools Forum in person for about 4 years, I think. So welcome everybody. I'm Dave Jones, the Chair. Members of the public are invited to view this meeting online and the meeting is being recorded. As we're meeting in person today, I'm just going to ask members to introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Hello, Alison Edgerton, Group Accountant for Children, Families and Education and Finance.
Mike Stoneman, Deputy Director for Education.
Liz Kemp, I'm the lead for the SEND and Alternative Provision Change Partnership Programme.
Chris Academy, Vice Principal, City of Portsmouth College, Post 16 Representative.
Hi, I'm Angela Mann. I'm Finance Manager for Children, Families and Education.
Hi, I'm Minty Butler. I'm the Early Years and Childcare Manager.
Jack Jones, Head of School at New Horizons Primary and Academy's Primary Representative.
Hi, Niz Hardingham, CEO of Saltons Academy Trust and Academy's Secondary Phase Representative.
I'm Jackie Collins, Head Teacher at Devonshire, and I'm the Maintained Schools Head Teacher Rep.
Hi, Cara Jewell, Early Years Rep.
Jane Dodino, Local Democracy Officer.
Nathan Waits, Chief Financial and Operating Officer at the Kersey Trust and the Academy's Secondary Schools Representative.
Hi, I'm Councillor Susie Horton, and for the purposes of this meeting, I am an observer.
That's great. Thank you everybody. Going to go over to apologies for absence to Alison.
We've received the following apologies for absence. Simon Graham, Maintained Secondary Representative. Sharon Burt, Special School Representative. Sally Hodgson, Primary Academy Representative. Ruth Walswick, Primary Academy Representative. Sarah Daly, Director of Children, Families and Education. Councillor Dyke, Portsmouth Independent Party. And Joe Cooper, Primary Academy Representative.
Thank you. And now on to declarations of interest. That's Alison again.
I've got the following declarations of interest outstanding: Councillor Coles and Councillor Dyke. I have written to both and reminded them to submit them.
Thank you. And then back over to Alison again for membership. Thank you.
Okay, I have the following membership updates. At the last meeting, we reported there were 3 tenures that were due to end after today's meeting. I have written to the 3 representatives concerned and can report the following. I'm waiting a response from Simon Graham at Secondary Maintained Schools. Representative Niz Hardingham for our Secondary Academy Schools has indicated that she would be happy to stand again, and I will be writing to Secondary Academy Trusts to inform them of that. Then the last one I've got is Jackie Collins, who is our Primary Maintained Representative. Jackie has decided to stand down from the forum after 10 years of service, and I would really like to thank her for her challenge and input to the forum over the last 10 years and wish her well. Following this meeting, we have 5 vacancies. 1 primary governor representative, 1 secondary governor representative and 3 secondary academy representatives. I will be writing again to ask for volunteers and hope that I might get somebody in future. And that's all the membership updates.
Thank you, Alison. I'd like to echo the thoughts about Jackie. Thank you, Jackie. 10 years is a long time on here. Okay. Minutes of the previous meeting.
They should be in the membership.
Okay. Did everyone see the minutes and see if they're correct record of the last meeting on the 11th of January 2024? If nobody's got any comments, can I ask someone to propose the approval? Chris, thank you. And seconder? Nis, thank you. Okay, the minutes of the previous meeting have therefore been approved. Are there any matters arising? I think it's just the agenda, isn't it?
There's no matters
No
arising.
matters arising. Okay, we'll go straight on to agenda item 6, the dedicated schools grant for 24-25. So that's over to Angela.
Thank you. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to read the report. There's 3 sections really of the report. The first is we've had to relook at the delegation for schools improvement following consultation with the DFE. And I can take you through that in a minute. The second section is about the high needs, and that covers the proposed budget for 24-25 and the pressures that we're facing in that budget, and also the proposals for the bandings for the element 3. The places was already discussed in the January meeting. And then the final section is about the early years proposals for the hourly rates to providers, and details the consultation that we undertook for that. So I suppose just in terms of the delegation, I think we mentioned at the last meeting that when we were looking at filling in the form back to the Department for Education, there wasn't an ability to record the primary decision as opposed to the secondary decision, so we had a query about that, and they came back to confirm that actually the decision needs to be made as a whole of maintained representatives, and so that's how come their form wouldn't allow us to do one thing for primary and one for secondary, and so we have fed back that the guidance could be clearer, but as a result of that decision is coming back today to make sure that we have it formally recorded as a group of maintained schools, what your decision is for the delegation for schools improvements. There's a lot of detail about the high needs DSG and also the early years, so I don't know whether anybody's got any questions or comments on the rest of the report.
Okay, so it's open to the floor. Any questions? So we look at the delegation aspect first, because I think that's... Are there any questions about that statement? Unfortunately, Simon's not here, so it's only myself and Jackie, which are the maintained schools here. We haven't got anything that would change, so I think we can do our vote on that section now.
That makes sense.
Right, yeah. Okay, so if there's no comments on that, it's recommended that all maintained schools, members of the Schools Forum, approve the delegation of the education functions related to the Montreux Programme grant for 24-25 at £10.42 per pupil for primary and secondary pupils. So pause to vote in favour. So in favour. Okay, that's carried, and that has been approved. Okay, so if we move on to the elements about the high needs budget, and any questions, comment there. Sorry.
I have got a question just in relation to high needs, but actually forgive me because it's probably for my own learning and possibly for colleagues around the room as well. But I just wonder if you could clarify how the high needs block is actually allocated to Portsmouth. And, you know, my understanding is for maintained schools, it's based on census data, and then the subsequent financial year allocation comes out of that. But is it a similar mechanism in relation to pupil numbers and those actually on roll in terms of how the high needs allocation comes to fruition?
Okay, so the high needs block is funded very differently to the the schools block. With the high needs block, they look at the number of pupils on the October census that are in special schools, that's maintained schools and academies. And then the rest of the funding formula is based on a number of characteristics of the Portsmouth area. So there is a percentage that's based on historic spend, and that historic spend is based, I think it's financial year 17-18. And that proportion is slowly shrinking as the years have obviously progressed. The rest of the formula is based on things like the number of pupils that are, the number of the population that are under a certain age that are in ill health, the number of children that are on IDACI, so that's the indices affecting children deprivation factors. It looks at, the disability factors, so that would look at those children that potentially are households that are in receipt of the disability living allowance, and we are funded on a proportion of those statistics. So it's quite a complicated and not a straightforward formula. The only thing that we receive direct funding for in relation to what we would pay out would be our special school pupils. So the funding we receive for the place funding, and the place funding alone, is the only thing that has a direct relation to the number of pupils we've got with education, health and care plans. Okay.
Could I just therefore follow up with a subsequent question then, again, just to aid my own understanding? So based on that, as we, I think, have seen recently, there has been an increase in EHCP children within mainstream settings, but presumably that's not actually picked up in terms of the government funding that is allocated to the local authority. Is that correct? So where that might have increased, that's not necessarily represented in the allocations coming through. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Nis?
Not entirely sure quite which order to ask these questions, so apologies. I think my first question is probably around the appendix on page 14. And if I'm reading the figures correctly, it appears as if the major responsibility for the increase in the high needs block is the increase in the element 3 top-up funding of 3.4 million approximately. Yeah, and was that something that we were anticipating when we met previously?
So the 3.4 million for the element 3 top-up will cover our special schools, our mainstream schools, inclusion centres. It would also cover alternative provision as well. And post-16. No, sorry, doesn't cover post-16, that's further down. So the increase we've seen, there's been a considerable increase in the level of need. We've noticed that particularly in our special schools, and where we would in the past have seen a fairly relatively stable level of need, that has increased considerably this year. We've also got the full year effect now of the Wimmering School, where last year we only had, at the beginning of the year, we only had 30 places when they opened in April, which increased in September. We've now got the full year impact of those 66 places within that element 3 top-up. We've seen a lot of pressure coming onto the city. We've worked very closely with our SEND team, going through the number of EHCP requests that they've received and how many they're dealing with, when they are expecting to get those approved, and therefore payments to start to come in. And we have seen a considerable increase in that area. We have scrutinised that very closely with the Education Department and the teams to make sure we're being reasonable in that increase. And we feel that we are tight on that budget, and there still is an element of risk within it.
I just wondered whether it was possible to have some more information around that figure, and because am I right that we're being asked to take decisions around the DSG? But what it looks to me as if we've got high level figures for the high needs block, and we're being asked to make decisions around banding figures. And I think if I understand some of your explanation, the banding, the increased complexity of need, therefore pushes us into the higher levels of banding funding, and so that there's an element of that. But I would just welcome the opportunity to understand, I think, what that movement is on the element 3 top-up funding and where it's occurring and how it's occurring to help us with our decision making around this.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. So within that 3.4 million, there's about 800,000 relates to the 1.84% increase on the actual banding levels. There's 900,000 relates to the increase in our mainstream schools. There's about 2.4 million will relate to the high needs for the special schools, the element 3 for the special schools, and approximately 66,000 of that will also relate to the special schools, so the inclusion centres.
Sorry, so that gives us an idea of the figures, but not the cause for the increase. So whether that is a rise in pupil numbers as a result in, you know, where you've talked about Wimmering, or where you've talked. So I think just it would be really useful to have a broader understanding of that, I think, as we're looking at what the recommendations and the solutions are moving forwards.
So with relation to Wimmering, the impact of that is about 400,000. When we are coming down to the mainstream, we have seen an increase in pupil numbers of approximately 196 pupil numbers in the way of requests that we're expecting to come through over the course of the next financial year. With relation to the special schools, the increase in places is relatively small in the fact it's about a net 2 increase in places, but we have it is that increase in levels of need. I don't have that level of detail with me for this particular meeting.
So is it okay if I carry on, or does somebody else want to? Go on, Mike. Go on.
Well, just to also mention the fact that, as you're probably aware, it's been well documented, there is a current backlog in terms of the EHC assessments that we're going through, and that is impacting on our forecast for 24-25. So they are being processed. We're clawing our way back through that backlog with the additional resources we've put in place, but that's obviously having that impact. I mean, we would have probably seen some of that in 23-24, but it's been delayed because of the backlog. So just to be aware of that issue.
Carry on this if you've got another question. I can see you're ready to go.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the decision around the DSG. Now, we haven't been in this particular position in terms of DSG transfers, I think, for a number of years. But I'm thinking back, and there used to be restrictions around how much we could transfer, or am I misremembering the direction of transfer?
So Schools Forum, we could request a transfer from the schools block to the high needs block. We haven't done that for a number of years. We feel it's counterintuitive, because all you're doing is reducing robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're not at that stage at the moment. We do have the balances which are helping us to manage it in 24-25. The plan is to work very closely with the Education Department to develop a 5-year DSG management plan, which will work through the implications of any capital expenditure, any increase in school places with special schools, and work through the implications of that, which will help us then to work out what our actions should be. I think it is 5% of the schools block that we can transfer if we wanted to, but I say we are trying to avoid that, and we certainly aren't planning to do that for 24-25.
So I think that takes me into the question around the paragraph in the report around 8.6. So my first question around that is, you use the phrase windfall savings, so it would be if you could explain where the windfall savings have come from. I think that would be helpful for the record. And then in terms of the DSG 5-year management plan and reviewing services to see what could be delivered differently for less, my interpretation of that is that we are, and please feel free to shoot me down if this is totally incorrect, my interpretation is that we are accepting that the high needs block is just going to create a larger deficit over time, and we're going to use the DSG carry forward to plug that deficit, and we're going to look at the things that we may have been doing to try and make our mainstream schools more inclusive or to prevent the demand for the high needs block. We're going to review those areas of expenditure rather than perhaps also focusing on what we can do with the high needs block. And I raise that because around 5 years ago, I think maybe a little bit longer, we had an issue with regard to funding in the high needs block, and we did a large collaborative exercise where everybody got together and we looked at how across the sector, high needs and within the mainstream block, how we could look at managing our finances differently to affect the savings we needed. And that was part of the body of work when we moved from bandings to the EHCPs rather than having individual amounts allocated for those that were within mainstream, and within the special sector there were savings that were proposed within that sector as well. So I know that's a bit of a complicated thing to answer. I think the questions are around where are the windfall, and a question mark around who's doing the DSG review. Why is it just the DSG that's being reviewed, and how will we review in the round and not just accept that we will be having a high needs deficit for the future.
Sorry, Angela, go on.
So to try and answer some of those things, in terms of the windfall, I think we've always felt that there's been a long tail of COVID coming. It's definitely been in terms of social care as well. So I think some things were a bit static for Portsmouth during COVID, and so potentially some referrals didn't actually happen. Now, whether or not COVID is now fueling some of these increases, we don't know, but I suppose that's where we projected. So, for example, in 23-24, we've projected what budget we needed, but actually some of those numbers haven't come through. So I suppose that's the windfall. But actually what we now seen is what Mike mentioned, and actually we're projecting, we've looked at how many of the requests become EHCPs, and we've projected that. We've looked, across the council, and I think about 70% of EHCPs going to mainstream school. So we've used that and the numbers that are known in the system to sort of project forward on financial modelling. But that's really the windfall. Really, that's referenced in the report. In terms of what we might be doing in the future, I think there's a holistic approach. I know you've mentioned about the element 3, but if you look at the information as well, there is a big pressure coming through early years and the support in early years, and that's definitely an area that Sarah Daly, Mike and colleagues are wanting to look at. Actually, always talk about the first 1,000 days, and actually the whole system. So how does the whole system support people, and so that is something that's starting to be looked at, as well as the DSG management plan. In terms of the sort of joint responsibility, Until March 26, the DSG is ring-fenced from a council's point of view. It's been seen to be its own responsibility, but we had notification that that would be the very last extension, and actually from April 26 it will be the council's responsibility to manage any deficit on that budget. And so at the moment, not that Portsmouth in that position because we have got the reserve, and so hopefully it buys us time to, you know, work with everybody to think about actually how can we improve things for everybody, improve their outcomes, try and you know, do the most appropriate interventions at the right time, so that hopefully will give us some cushion and time to do that work and then start to implement it. But there is the issue that we're not in a position that the council has got to look after this deficit until March 26, but we will need to work together as the council, the whole system, and, you know, with schools, with early years, you know, post-16 as well, to look at actually how do we meet the needs of everybody within the funding that we've got. So so yeah, so it's not just seen as a DSG issue, and it probably wouldn't have been, you know, even if the changes are happening in terms of whose responsibility it is for the deficit. But obviously it does change things in terms of, you know, and this is why the likes of Hampshire, etc., you know, have talked about, you know, their financial difficulties because they have got very big deficits in their high needs DSG. So hopefully that gives you the reassurance that we are seeing it as a whole system really, and not just dedicated school grant and high needs block. I think there was a third question as well.
Yeah, I was just sort of building on what Nis has said there, because I think it's, I'm not necessarily saying you can answer this at all, but we appear to be asking for the places we've got in special, you know, it's huge costs. We're getting increased numbers of children with significant needs in mainstream, many of whom in previous years possibly would have gone into special education. And then, you know, what my concern is, you know, we're asking, so what could be delivered differently for less? I think is that an almost impossible question? You know, are we actually saying, well, I can't see, so anybody tasked with looking at this is going, how are we going to deliver that for less? I just, you know, as Nis said, you know, you know, these options purely of either looking at reducing the numbers at certain core enhanced values, etc., both assumed, you know, mainstream and special. What difference is that making? Is that, as Nis said, is that one of the things? Is this a banding issue, or I'm not sure. I haven't got an answer. I'm not sure anyone has. But I just think we need to be really clear that this almost seems like an impossible situation, which is obviously why so many authorities, you know, have been struggling massively. It's not really a question, but if you want to join in.
Well, just to say, it is almost not quite an impossible task, but it is incredibly challenging what we're faced with, and we'll be kicking off these discussions around the DSG management plan next week internally. But I would welcome actually wider support around working on that plan, and that will be looking at, as Angela said, it's a holistic assessment. We'll be looking at the DSG and the high needs block and our spending around that, but also what interventions we can put in place, what early work we can do to try and stem that demand, because, you know, we've seen a very significant increase in assessments, particularly from the early years sector, so massive increase there. how can we put in support in the early years sector, for example, to try and address need and not move necessarily to an EHC assessment, and then make sure that in year reception and into year one we've got provision which can meet that need and may not therefore necessarily need an assessment and an EHCP. And we had, as you know, set up a working group which had this acronym of SMILE, which when it was set up was in a rather different situation where we had a large DSG carry forward in front of us. We were still at that point underspending on the high needs block, and we thought we could use some of that funding in the carry forward to actually do some of this work that I'm talking about. Now that group did meet, came up with a whole range of proposals, but we've had to put that on pause because of the pressure now that we are seeing in 24-25, and indeed there are pressures which we are identifying for 25-26 onwards. That's not to say we won't do some of that, but we now have to see that in the context of a DSG management plan to make sure that what we do bring forward is affordable, recognising that there is an argument for doing some of these things because it will stem that demand, but it does require a significant piece of work to do that. But yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I do think, given the potentially controversial nature of this, in that, as you said, you know, a few months ago we were looking at a very rosy position and we were patting ourselves on the back because we were one of the few local authorities that were managing its high needs block. And then I have to say, I only saw this paper on Friday. I believe that was when it was published, so haven't really had very long to digest it or to share it widely at all. So I feel quite uncomfortable making a decision today around the recommendations. I think there is a lot more detail to be shared with regards to why the high needs block is now overspent, and that information, I think it would be better if that was in the pub, or potentially overspent for next year, sorry. I think it would be better if that was more widely available so we could actually identify and share with colleagues across the sector where the pressures are, what the issues are in this particular year coming. And I would welcome a more open and transparent approach to how we resolve this with the DSG management plan, if that's what we think is the way forwards, because it's really important that we invest in order to prevent future costs rising, alongside looking at where we might do any cost cutting that might be needed. And I think it's also really important that the right people evaluate the effectiveness of programmes that we may or may not have had in place. And this is about education, so it definitely needs to have education practitioners involved in the decision making and any discussions, I think, around where we might focus our energies or not, if that's possible.
Yep, I'd welcome that, and we can pick that up next week when we have our first discussions around this. Yeah.
Just to say that the DSG management plan has to come through Schools Forum. The DFE insists that it comes through Schools Forum, so we're, going forward, we will be involving Schools Forum representatives in that process.
I think it was more around thinking about the principles of decision making as opposed to endorsing the decisions that have been made, and I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, isn't it, with what are we going to do with the 9 million and how are we going to respond to this current challenge. And we're not in the position that other local authorities are in, as you said, Angela, with regard to their in deficit and so on at the moment, so our level of panic can be different to theirs. But we need, I think, ownership across the sector of whatever it is we decide to do, as opposed to just endorsement of a plan that hasn't been made in a more open way, if that's a feasible way of doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that, Nis, and I think it's what's really challenging is, it's this little bit of no answers until we do a bit more work, and I think it is really hard to look at these and make the decision now without that additional work and thought, because there's a huge amount of pressure on all of us at the moment, And if we do, you know, there are, I'm sure there were some great ideas from the Smile group as it was, and one of my questions was to ask you about that group and to see what some solutions might be. You know, it feels a little bit at the minute we're just sort of saying we're not going to do anything, and that sort of worries me a little bit. And you know, we've got to build on the success, as Nis says, of what we have been doing over a number of years and keeping in the budget. But then, you know, it's that question of how have we managed to do that, and is it possibly, you know, we talked about in the late group of when we can invest at the right times in order for the education within the city to become more successful. And I think that's the balance of where we need to sort of choose. Any more thoughts or comments, questions? Sorry. Andrew.
Just realised that we probably haven't really told everybody what the DSG management plan is as well. So just want to clarify, I suppose. So one of the things that it does is it makes us look at the numbers of people that we've got being supported in the system, and then forecasts those numbers going forwards for 5 years and what we think our funding's going to be, and then that's what that plan is really. And then what happens, so then after 5 years you'll get to a position of, okay, if we carry on, this is what would happen. And I suppose that's what we're sort of thinking about, actually, what do we know at the moment to do that. But then you're quite right, the next part then is actually, given what that is telling us, what do we want to do differently? And then you then take those different ideas and model what those consequences might be, both in terms of numbers of children that it might affect and also the financial consequences. And, you know, it's a big glorified spreadsheet, but what it then does is say, right, with these different interventions, this would be what your outcome would be, and sort of helps you to strategically manage, you know, sort of deficits and how you might then go back to a recovery position. So the first thing is actually, what do we think would happen? But actually, definitely, you know, we need everybody to work together to say, right, what are the interventions? What has Smile said? What does everybody else know? You know, there's the exciting investment in speech and language, thankfully, that Portsmouth has got as part of this SEND and an AP change programme, which hopefully speech and language is, you know, fundamental. So hopefully that will start to, you know, have some improvements of its own. And thinking about those sorts of things, it will then, like I say, it's a forecasting tool, and it will help us to see whether or not with these things, does it make a difference? Is it good enough? And you know, it'll be a bit of a iterative process really, potentially, and then we will be able to then monitor against that to say, okay, this is what our plans were, has it achieved what we want it to achieve? So that's sort of the management plan. But yeah, so some of it we'll have to think about, what do we know to try and forecast for the future for those 5 years, and then looking at all the different pieces of work we want to do to try and change that forecast.
So can we go back to paragraph 8.6 then, where it says in the middle of it, as previously mentioned, the authority is developing a DSG 5-year management plan and reviewing services to see what could be delivered differently for less. It feels as if there's a great big gap missing in the middle of that sentence from your explanation of the DSG management plan, in that it's just something that you do as a normal course of events. It feels as if the outcome of that forecasting might be something that might need to be shared, so that we can understand why there is a need to even write that sentence down about reviewing services to see what could be delivered for less.
Well, so I mean, at the moment we know that the numbers of pupils that we have got, if they do get any HCP in the pattern that our current pupils have got, we will have a pressure of £2.5 million that isn't within in-year funding for this year. The full year effect of those pupils is about 1.1 million for next year, for the 25-26, and we also know that there are plans to increase places, specialist places in inclusion centres, which I think for 25-26 is another £300,000. So that is about 4 million. If our funding doesn't really increase very much, then that would be £4 million pressure compared to in-year funding for 25-26. So we have got to do something differently. It wasn't written in a way that will be reducing the bandings or anything like that. It's about how can we do things differently to maximise the investment, to improve the to maximise the outcomes of all the pupils and children that it affects.
I just want to come in really with a query. Might not be a question that can be answered this evening. I think just listening to the comments made and then some of the figures that were given, I think as well with, I just want to pick up on inclusion centres maybe in specific here, but hearing the increase we've had in inclusion centre spaces, we're recognising that children who would have necessarily been placed in a special school are now being placed in inclusion centres, and then vice versa, we're seeing children who would have been placed in inclusion centres in mainstream school. I'm struggling to maybe understand why the growth of 2.4 million is being projected for a special school area, whereas only a 66,000 is only being projected for a inclusion centre, when actually those inclusion centres are delivering what a special school would be. And I think the impact on a school's budget around that is significant. Colleagues around the city who have those attached to their schools, I'm aware of some schools nearly in 100,000 deficit in just relation to that area of their school. So I'm struggling to understand how that contrast is so significant in relation to what we're being asked and colleagues are being asked to deliver already in a way that's doing something differently for less, trying to meet the needs. So for me, just a reflection maybe of the conversation, it can't be answered, but I definitely feel like more information around that could be shared at this meeting and this forum to understand, why we're talking about, a 1.8 million difference in that funding gap. So some more information, I guess, is what I'm asking for to be considered.
I'd just come in and say that my recollection of previous times when the high needs block has been overspent has been that we have had quite detailed reports and analysis so that we could have a thorough understanding of what's going on as well. So my recollection from years gone by, I don't know if you remember as well, Jackie, is that that's the sort of information that we would be receiving alongside a statement of a deficit of 2.5 million.
So first of all, I think I acknowledge the difficulties that the high needs block presents to local authority. I've previously worked with a college in a local authority that did have significant pressures on the high need block, to the point where they did have to do 5% movement from the DSG into the high needs block due to those increasing pressures. So I think it's every local authority is probably feeling that right now. From a post-16 representative, obviously we've been seeing an increase in student numbers who we need top-up funding. And we're seeing more complex needs coming through, which means that we're actually having to put more interventions in place, more complex interventions, and rewrite what the provision of the institution looks like. So I think it's really important that we actually do a demographic mapping exercise to inform future place planning. The pressure that's puts on post-16 is actually interventions maybe early on in the stage. We've still got interventions coming through, and we're kind of almost the end of the line on that respect. The intervention rates in post-16 is something we do need to review, because I know they haven't been looked at, but I'd welcome a discussion with local authority to look at that. But I think it's really important that we understand the provision type, we get the right provision and the right intervention, the right place. So as an institution, we can look 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead of what does the post-16 provision type, what does it need to look like? What type of provision does it need to be in place? Does it need to be, what type of specialist provision? One, so we can recruit, we can train staff, because a lot of this takes a lot of time to put in place to get the right, not just getting everything in place for that student, it's getting the right people in place, it's getting the right equipment, it's getting the right capacity in terms of building in place. So I think it's really important we do really look quite far ahead and understand what the pressures are going to be on the budget, but also what that provision really needs to look like. I know it's the same across the sector, but we need to look what that provision is going to look like, because I think we'll be able to support students a lot better, and that in turn might reduce costs if we spend time doing that provision mapping and provision planning rather than putting short-term interventions in place, particularly when we look at post-16, because often students come with a bit of mapping of understanding what those students' needs are, but you've only in reality got a 6-week window from when they finish the GCSEs or whichever programme they're involved in to when they start at a college. It's not a lot of time to put that intervention in place, whereas if we've got a significant amount of time to understand this is what we believe is coming through, it means actually your cost base is less because you're more prepared for what's coming through the door, and therefore you're not having to put what you'd call rapid interventions in place to support students. So I'd welcome the opportunity to work with local authority and schools forum to do that.
Just come on that one, and yeah, absolutely support what you're saying, Chris, and we have done a lot of work on our forecasting to support these figures. Worth also saying that in terms of post-16, we've established a transition group, and we're working closely with colleagues at the City Portsmouth College around those transitions and looking at need and projecting that forward. So there is quite a lot of work in place, working very closely with post-16 colleagues. So just to reassure you on that point, I know you're aware of that. But just wanted to let other forum members know that's in place.
I suppose I just wanted to clarify as well, and we're looking at these almost on a year-by-year basis, and whilst I recognise that you've identified what the future patterns can look like, but talking from experience as an academy, I submit in July where my expected outturn for the end of that financial year, then a detailed working budget for the future year, and then subsequently my forecast for the forthcoming subsequent 2 years as well. And it was just interesting to hear that actually some of this funding which we're reviewing and considering now is based on demographic data dating back to 1718. Is there any mechanism for effectively reporting your forecast and reporting the demographic changes and increased needs that we're seeing, which I appreciate might be picked up on the school censuses, but at the same time, from a local authority perspective, I just wonder what mechanism of reporting our concerns upwards there might be.
So Mike can talk about sort of the different groups that he has connections with, but in terms of Alison and I, we're part of a South East Finance Officers group who meets with colleagues from other local authorities in the DFE, and we have a mixture of different authorities. Some are in safety valve, some are delivering better value, and ourselves, and we do voice our concerns about the funding that we're getting. So we do have those regular conversations with the DFE, and so Mike, I don't know whether you want to sort of
Well, yeah, in similar vein, we've been doing quite a bit of lobbying and discussion around this issue through the South East 19 local authorities at DCS level, so Sarah Daly, at my level, the AD level, we have a network, and there is also a SEND group as well across the South East. So that, and the DFE attend those meetings, so they're hearing this, they're hearing the pressures, they are acutely aware of it, and I hope at some point we're going to see a significant injection of funding, but at the moment, we haven't seen that.
Thank you. I think it's important that we note that all our concerns here at Schools Forum, that some of this, the things we want to do aren't sustainable at the moment, aren't they? Liz, sorry, would you?
Yeah, I'd just like to come in and follow up and endorse what Jack Jones has just said about the inclusion centres, because there's no doubt that there are children in our inclusion centres that until recently would have been in mainstream schools, or in fact, in some cases, as we have discussed at our annual contract reviews, could be in special provision now. And I absolutely endorse that. We need to look at how we support our inclusion centres, because they're a key part of our overall SEND system in the city. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? We have children in our mainstream schools that would meet criteria for specialist provision. And just reiterating what's been said, looking at the, I mean, I understand that there's the complexity of need is increased in special schools. The complexity of need is increased everywhere. And when I look at the top-up funding for mainstream schools compared with somewhere like Cliffdale, you know, then that makes it incredibly difficult when you've got 2 or 3 in a class to get anybody of any quality, or to get anybody, full stop, because of the money that we're getting. Now, I understand that we were given exceptional funding for all our children, which is £5,000. But when you have a child with exceptional needs who needs a full-time one-to-one, £5,000 doesn't go far. So, and that's the problem. And I think there's all just to be noted. I think when we're talking about recruitment and retention, I think staff are absolutely on their knees, because it feels like we are delivering special school education but without any of the resources.
Well, I kind of agree with what you're saying. Just worth noting that, you know, if you compare this local authority with many other local authorities, and you look at the proportion of our pupils that are in special schools, yeah, we're not out of sync. In fact, we have a slight, in many cases, we're slightly higher, above the norm. It's just a bit of context to say that this is being replicated across the country. You know, it's not an answer to your question, but it's just important to note that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's criticism of the authority. I'm saying it's criticism of the country as a whole, and we wonder why education is going down the pan, quite frankly. And it's clearly a government thing, but
So I just wanted to touch on the early years, because obviously it's been mentioned quite a lot, but as we've seen, there's a national rollout now of new funding for children from 9 months by the end of this year. Obviously, just looking at the high needs pressures, that's going to add a significant thing, and we have no data on these children. I have children every year who arrive at this time of year, and within 3 weeks you're like, this child is going to need substantial support at school. We have no data on these children. So I just wanted to add in that obviously there may be a whole new group of children that we have absolutely no data on that's really going to add this pressure.
And can I perhaps just add in a similar tack that, you know, some of the children who are now entering the system are those babies that were born during lockdown and possibly didn't have access to the same developmental groups, etc., which previous cohorts of children would have done. So actually, when we're looking at the numbers that are coming into the system and looking at how we best support those children, you know, who are very young or who are potentially yet to be born, recognising probably the pressures on many a public service, but actually, whilst we're talking in question about the education services that we're providing, there's potentially other agencies who might previously have been involved and had additional resources and support many years ago who now don't have that, or you know, a Sure Start Centre, for example, which you know, aren't those types of resources and provision aren't necessarily there. But when we're looking at the approach to how we might support the wider system, are we engaging with those other agencies who might be able to help support and reach at least some measures to address concerns as they develop and progress through the system as well.
And the answer to that is absolutely we are, but as you probably will guess, there are pressures in terms of resources in those other areas. So health has just been, a good example of that. And I know we've got children arriving in year reception, some of whom we've just not had our eyes on them. There has not been that support. So that clearly needs to be invested in. But yeah, there is a resource issue there as well. But yeah, we are absolutely engaged with all those other agencies.
I realise that we haven't put all the numbers in terms of the growth, and apologies. It's sort of we've been in a darkened room since I suppose the announcement of the figures and trying to look at the schools block and the early years consultation, we've been working extremely hard with our education colleagues as well to look at what the figures are and what our projections are. We have looked at our early years numbers that we've got at the moment and how they might change for the new entitlements. Now, we don't know, what that might mean, but, the new entitlements are for people who are working already, who are working, so they might be using, the early years settings already. But we have tried to do a prediction in case there's increases in those numbers. And we have looked at the numbers of children we've got in the early years settings that will transfer, in September to go into, year R. So, we have looked at that. We've also looked at the numbers of children that are, in year 11, and where they might be going and what our predictions are in terms of our numbers of placements for post-16. So we have tried to factor all of those things in. And like I say, in terms of the numbers of people who are likely to get an education, health and care plan this year, there's a lot of people already known to the SEND team already, and they're working their way through those assessments. So apologies that I haven't put all of those figures in, but we have used those for forecasting in terms of going forwards. Obviously, if those forecasts don't materialise and the numbers are less, then what we'll need to use from the DSG reserve will be less. But there are certain things that we are at risk at, I think, because we've tried to look at actually the complexity of need in our special schools that we've seen in 23-24, but whereas we probably would have increased that for the following year, we've assumed that that complexity of need stays the same. So so that might mean that there's a bigger, hit on the DSG reserve, both in inclusion centres and, well, it's not just both, it's inclusion centres, mainstream, element 3, and also special schools. But we've tried to base it on the actual bandings that people have got and then looked at the forecasts in increases and applied those costs to those. But we can certainly bring back in more detail the numbers of children in all of these things, so that you are aware of the numbers that we're looking at in terms of Portsmouth City Council.
Jack?
Thank you. I've got two questions. First of all, is we've talked about demographic as well a second ago and comparable statistical neighbours. I'm just wondering when that work's been done on, are all demographic features of deprivation being accounted for rather than just our for EHC plans and for special school places, or is it just what the authorities that are on our doorstep that we're working with? or are they taking into consideration, you know, the demographic of coastal city and all of those other elements that have made us a PEIA area? That's my first question. And then my second question is, it seems that we've got a rising pupil number that of children that may or may not meet threshold for any HCP plan. However, we've also got the polar opposite issue where we've got a surplus of spaces that's quite significant, which then impacts on schools' ability to maintain a healthy budget as well. So I think what we haven't recognised within this is that we're facing a two-pronged circumstance where, you know, I believe across the city it's about 15% surplus spaces to number of pupils, and the impact that has on schools to maintain their budget and have the right number of staff to manage that, but then also increasing the need where the funding's not matching that. So I think it's important to recognise that we've got both of these problems attacking the local authority at the same time. And whilst I appreciate that the local authority are doing lots around that, and there's communication that's happened with heads around that and working parties and things happening, I think it needs to be noted at this point that they are both having a negative impact at once. So it's balancing a school's budget around that is extremely challenging. That's more of a comment, I guess, than a question. But the question around demographic and statistical neighbours and how that looks would be interesting data to look at, because whilst I recognise that we may have similar special school spaces and inclusion centre spaces in line with neighbours, are they demographically statistical neighbours? Yeah, so I just would like that information, I think, as well as part of this.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of some of the benchmarking data, really happy to provide that. So yes, can do that. And in terms of your comment, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. We are seeing now a surplus in early years and Key Stage 1. It does vary across the city, as you'll appreciate. And we have actually seen very significant in-year transfers, which have mitigated some of that. But no, that surplus in Key Stage 1 is increasing. That's true.
I just add as well, because obviously a lot of the in-year transfers tend to come after Christmas, which then impacts on census, which impacts on schools' ability to afford that moving forward. So I think there's the two-pronged difficulty there, which isn't a local authority issue. Again, it's a national issue because of the way funding's managed. But again, it's important to note that the in-year transfers, you know, in Portsmouth, I know we tend to see a surge after Christmas. You know, I can only talk about my school in particular at the moment on data, but I'm double the number of in-year transfers than I normally would have had at this time last year. So yeah, just I appreciate the comment, but it's also difficult when it comes to the school's budget.
That's I mean, also the lag funding we've got will account for that eventually, but yeah, it creates a short-term pressure. I agree. Yeah.
Okay, lots of thoughts there, lots of difficult things, because it's a difficult situation to be in when we don't have the funding we think we know that we deserve, know that our children deserve. Moving on to the recommendations, just can clarify for me, Alison, that just endorsing is.
So the decision.
Sorry.
So the decision actually lies with the Cabinet member rather than Schools Forum. Schools Forum are either endorsing the proposal or not, but the decision does lie with our Cabinet member.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I propose then that we move forward to a vote on the recommendations. Can I just check how many people are eligible to vote on this? Sorry. Sorry, it's the more comments on early years, it's all part of the same thing. Sorry, carry on, Cara, if you want to ask more questions. Sorry.
Sorry, it's just because we haven't looked at the early years part before you make your decisions. So from speaking to early years providers, I think on the whole people are obviously not happy with the rate but feel it's appropriate, but I think it's relevant to say that a number of concerns are raised about if that 5% pass through to the local authority does drop at any point. Obviously we've spoken already about the pressures coming up with early years and high needs, and actually it's a really complexity because we need the money on the front line for the children to get the most for them, but obviously also I want it noted that obviously the concern is that we lose the services that will support early years with these children as well.
Again, the difficult balance of the 5% providing the services to support early years, early years providers could do with that 5% in their budgets as well. And we want to add to that. It's I recognise those services are really important, but everyone's under pressure. Mindy, I don't you want anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that the early years providers have used our services probably more than they ever have in the last 5 years. I mean, our team is absolutely inundated. The early years funding team has got extra pressures because there's different grants coming in. There's lots of parental questions. There's the new extended entitlements where, you know, it's a whole new process. So the funding team's inundated. We've already talked about inclusion. You know, that our outreach officers have never been so busy. And we've also got pressure from our outreach officers who find childcare places for all of our children in the city. You know, they're working overtime at the moment as well, trying to find places for all of these new children that are going to be coming into the system in April and September. And it's also worth noting that we also run the family information service across the city as well. So we, our team actually manages all the parent contacts and gives them all the information and support that they need as well. And then finally, the quality and sufficiency that we have to look after as well for making sure we're Ofsted ready and supporting the providers that don't have good outcomes or need support. So I think, you know, I absolutely recognise that 5% would be welcome into the funding stream, but also I don't know what they would do without our support as well. So, yeah.
Gary, are early years providers, you know, well aware of the support they're getting through this 5%?
So I think early years providers know about the support. I don't think they link that support comes through the 5%. So as you'll see from the survey, there's people going, well, that 5% would be better spent. And actually, when you speak to them, if you said, well, if I took that 5% away and took away this, and this, that's where it comes. But obviously, because it's in the minutes, I wanted it documented that actually the providers need the money on the front line, but they also need the vital services that the 5% provides.
Yeah, of course. And then, you know, my next point was, you know, do we need to do more to make that link to early years, you know, to all of the early years providers?
So I think one thing we spoke about before is we had an early years providers group where we spoke about the schools forum and explained it a bit more about funding, and we have spoken about restarting that. So that was led by providers, but actually explaining to people what the DSG is, what the funding is and how it works, because I think there's a lot of confusion within early years, because as you can imagine, stuff comes up from government, it's not very clear, as we all know, and then suddenly the 2 pence rise is, oh, well, the local authority have gone off on a holiday on it, and you're going, okay, where? But those kind of discussions happen, so I know within providers we are talking about starting that again.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay. So we'll move on now. If everyone's happy, move on to the endorsements. So how many people got eligible to vote? Is it?
All schools forum members.
All schools forum members. Okay, thank you. So, we'll take one by one, I think. 2.21, endorsing the determination of the school's budget set out in Appendix 1. So, all those in favour? So that's the determination, as in just the Appendix 1, yeah. Okay. So that's the proposed budget revisions and everything, yeah. So 2.21, all those in favour of endorsing? Yeah. Five. Sorry, that was out of? 7, okay. Okay. Sorry, I need to do those against. Yeah, those against. Okay. And therefore that's one abstention. Okay. 2.22, endorse a proposal to use carry forward balances to fund the shortfall in 24-25. Manage any potential financial pressures during the financial year. All those in favour?
Nathan's got his hand up.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, 5. Those again? Sorry.
Can it, you know, is it possible that it can almost come with a caveat that the cabinet member making the decision does have sight and consideration of the concerns which have been voiced during the discussions within the forum?
Okay. Sorry, and those against? Sorry, thank you. 2.23, endorse the element 3 top-up values as set out in Appendix 2. All those in favour? Is that 3? 4. Sorry. And those against? Okay. So that's 2 against. And again, I think the proviso that I think there seems to be, we need more extensive work on this area and a possible explanation, which I'm sure hopefully Mike will come as part of the work you're doing. And 2.24, endorse the early years funding formula as set out in section 7 and appendix 1. All those in favour? 7. Okay, thank you. Some challenges there, so obviously I know Cabinet Member will have noted the discussions there. The date of the next meeting is the 22nd of May 24. I suppose unless we need to be called back for anything that comes from any of the work that Mike is doing, which might be welcomed, and you know, I'm sure Schools Forum members would be glad to support any of that work.
Yeah, absolutely, and more detail to follow. But yeah, we welcome that, and we'll be informing Schools Forum members of that work and how you can be involved.
Thank you, Mike. So that's the end of the meeting. So we'll just wait for the live recording.